Well, you know, they used to work together.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, the mayor met his bride in City Hall, and she was one of my speechwriters. So on occasion, these days, we'll be on the dais together, and I get up to speak. I say, I don't have a speech because she didn't write one.
That's right.
But he, you later on in this semester, you will meet Herbert Block. Now, Herbert Block is, I guess I first met when he was 12 or 13 years old, and he was a sort of a political buff, and he would, in those days, the recording machines were big, and he had his great big recording machine around. And I spent more time with him than did Charlie Rangel or Percy Sutton or some of the others because I like kids. So we just fell in love. And he started to go to Columbia, and he came to me one day and he said that he was going to drop out to work in the Mondale campaign.
That's right, 1984.
And I said, no, man, there'll always be another campaign. Get your education first. He did not take my advice. Worked in the Mondale campaign where he met one Bill de Blasio. Fast forward many years later, and de Blasio was looking to get involved in some campaign, and that young woman standing over there, her daddy's name was Bill, he's gone now, Bill Lynch. And so Herbie finally got de Blasio to meet Bill Lynch. It took a long time, but when he finally met him, Herbie's version of it, they talked to de Blasio 5 minutes and said, "You're hired." And that was Bill Lynch, who was Herb Block is responsible for him becoming mayor. And you'll get to meet Herb Block later.
That's right.
We got a session on race, and he's an Orthodox Jew, one of the finest people I know. So, Mr. Mayor,
Yes, sir.
we've been talking about intergovernmental type stuff.
Yeah.
And I know that you live it daily.
Uh-huh.
And please say hello to your bride for
I
me.
will indeed.
And the children.
I will indeed. And can I just jump in and
Go.
Well, let me thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And so I want to just emphasize that the mayor's story is very telling for everyone on their path, because he's exactly right. Herbert Block goes to a campaign he probably shouldn't have bothered to go to, 1984 Mondale campaign. It was not a very, likely victory up ahead. And but he did it out of belief. I went there out of belief. We met each other. Exactly right. I got to interview with Stacy's dad, who was then Mayor Dinkins' campaign manager in 1989. Was blessed enough to get the job. I always remind people I got the lowest job on the totem pole. I was the volunteer coordinator in his first campaign. I was the lowest paid person at the bottom of the organizational chart, but it was a beginning. I had the honor of working for the mayor in City Hall. Yes, met my wife Charlene there. Got to work with this good man before I had to call him Judge. He was a great colleague. You got an impressive job title. I just became a politician. You got a great job title. But it is an amazing statement in terms of just the interesting randomness of life. But if you are motivated by a belief in something, how doors strangely open and opportunity emerges. But yeah, we all have this extraordinary link, some of which was random, but most of which was about what we believed. And there's no question that the opportunity to have worked for Mayor Dinkins and all the other experiences I had blessed me and gave me the opportunity to do this work today. So, Mr. Mayor, thank you for giving me my start and for all you did for this city. and
Thank you
continue.
for what you did for our city, because I tell people often that nobody gets anywhere alone.
Amen.
Everybody stands on somebody's shoulders. And her daddy, Bill Lynch, taught us that. And to interrupt you a second further, I asked this question of like fifth grade students, and I ask it also of adults. And let's see how well you do. There's a turtle, and turtles on top of a fence post, 6-8 feet high. What's the one thing you know?
Huh. The turtle shouldn't jump.
What's the one thing you know, students? Huh? Sure, he didn't get there by himself.
Amen. Much better answer.
So, but because of Bill de Blasio and Bill Lynch and George Daniels and a whole lot of wonderful people, we got some things done. I got the credit, but they did the work. They were the ones with the great ideas and the enthusiasm, and his bride, she used to write speeches, made me sound intelligent.
Well, and I will say the circle is unbroken because Stacy is now working for me at City Hall. So the next generation is coming up, so it all comes together. So let me hear what's on your mind. Anything you want to ask in the time I get to be with you? It's my pleasure. This is my alma mater, so it's nice to be back.
Yeah,
There is hope after SEPA, let me tell you. So anything on your mind? Questions of any kind? Yes, please.
First, I'd like to thank you for the aid that you've given to Puerto Rico and Puerto Rican. My family's there right now.
Have you been in touch with your family?
I have.
Good.
Thankfully, recently, I got in touch with them finally.
Amen.
And everyone's okay. But I do have another question concerning Rikers.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that you've stated that you would like to see the plan implemented within a 10-year timeline.
Yes.
However, there are a lot of civil society advocates who are pushing for a 3-year timeline, and who are willing to put in the work to make that happen. So what is the reasoning behind that decision?
Yeah, I was, before I ran for anything, I was an activist for many years in a number of different movements. And in fact, I was down at my other alma mater earlier, NYU, and a group of student activists literally pulled out a newspaper from 1983, me fighting for the same thing they're still fighting for at NYU today. So when I hear you talk about the advocates, I have an inherent appreciation for advocates, but I also have a bit of a cold eye when it comes to the question of did the advocates really look at all of the facts in coming to their view. This one kind of perplexes me for a simple reason. Judge Lippman, who was the head of the state court system and the head of the highest court in the state until very recently, a paragon of reform, parallel to the process we undertook at City Hall, did an independent commission to look at the Rikers question, and he adamantly wanted to close Rikers. It was an independent commission, but with a major, major bias in favor of closure. His commission confirmed closure was necessary and doable. He said 10 years was the realistic timeline. So two different tracks both came to the same conclusion. Why? Because the capacity of our jail system now, we're around 9,100, 9,200 people in our jail system total, Rikers and the rest, is much, much lower than it used to be. 20 plus years ago, it was literally over 20,000 people in jail on any given day. So we've come down a lot, but our belief is we have to get down to 5,000 on a sustained basis to get off Rikers. And think about it for a moment. Rikers is 85 years old, so for 85 years the notion was let's create this other separate space, and that would be the workhorse of our correction system. To say that's not going to exist anymore, you really need to have alternatives in place and you need to have realistic numbers. So we envision several more brand new facilities being built, which will require the approval of the City Council, obviously working with their communities, and will require, unfortunately, lengthy construction. We have to reduce the number in the system overall, even if we get those new facilities built. We are arresting fewer and fewer people. That's fantastic. We're doing more on bail reform, more on alternatives to incarceration. But the sheer dynamic of essentially cutting our prison population almost in half again is punishing. It's very tough. And available moment, I want to close it, but I believe that is 10 years. Whatever else is on people's minds. Yes?
I'd like to know what are your thoughts and position on designing and implementing mediation and negotiation into middle schools. Not as a lesson plan, but more as in implementing it as the No Child Left Behind Act, whereas it's embedded in the school culture and the faculty and administration is thoroughly trained.
Do you mean like an alternative to suspension and other disciplinary actions?
Would that be conflict resolution, dispute resolution?
Yeah.
More so promoting focus on underlying interests rather than on demands and positions. They have a program like this in Israel.
Okay, you're way ahead of me. I'm not familiar with that. I also don't know the specific provision in No Child Left Behind, and obviously No Child Left Behind has now been superseded by a new Education Act federally. We do believe, the one thing I can pull from that is we do believe very strongly in conflict resolution and other approaches, and more modern, more peer counseling and other approaches that have reduced greatly the amount of suspension. We think there was much too quick a propensity and too great a propensity to suspend in the city for many years, and that it did unfortunately cut along racial lines on top of that. We've reduced the suspension rate markedly, and we're finding that safety in the school continues to improve. But I've been to some of the peer counseling sessions and seen them, and that's definitely the way forward, but I can't speak to the level you're talking about. Yes?
So hurricane season is not over.
No.
And I'm wondering if
I
you
just
speak
asked the other day, and for New York City, that formally it's till the end of November.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could talk about the improvements to resiliency and hurricane and flood preparedness that you've achieved, your goals for before your tenure is over, and what are the challenges that you face in that?
Well, it's a sobering challenge. So the first thing I would say, and again, you guys, God help you, you've chosen the path of public service. I commend you. I wouldn't have chosen anything else in retrospect, but I will tell you this is the kind of thing that just plain sucks about public service. Like, what do you do with global warming, right? So it's this massive, sprawling challenge. So we right now are in the middle of a $20 billion plan for the 5 boroughs. $20 billion resiliency plan. And I don't think that's the end of what is needed by any stretch. I think the $20 billion plan will make us a lot safer. Now, it will take years to be achieved. It'll make us a lot safer. But we won't be done at that point. And if global warming does not begin to reverse, if all the efforts out there don't start to succeed, we would need a whole lot more. What's better? What's better is a number of the areas most deeply affected by Sandy have had a lot of work done between the city, the Army Corps of Engineers, and other entities. The most notable example, the boardwalk at the Rockaways. So this is a real classic example of what, humanity was missing in its relationship with nature. We all have unfortunately learned the lesson of Katrina and how some of the man-made shipping lanes that were built for New Orleans exacerbated the effect of the storm and gave you what we know to be Katrina. That if that had not been done to the environment, Katrina would have nowhere near as bad an impact. Well, a much smaller example is the boardwalk, or the Rockaways. For years, a lovely wooden boardwalk. When the storm hit, when Sandy hit, that boardwalk was thrown into the surrounding neighborhood and added to the destruction. It was just like a battering ram. The new boardwalk we opened at the beginning of the summer, 5.5 miles, and it is secured into the ground, and it's built as a coastal barrier, so that it is literally performing the opposite function to what was there previously. It is now part of the resiliency structure. It would stop a lot of water. Even a real huge surge would be stopped by it. That's one example. A lot of the beaches have been restored, Rockaways, Coney Island, some other places, built up to be much, berms, like built up very high to resist most flooding. And a number of other measures, particularly for individual buildings, are underway, like Bellevue Hospital, NYU Hospital. The plan will just keep building out. And it will, with each year, make us safer. So city writ large, unquestionably, the hardest hit areas are safer, more to do. Other areas need more work, but it will not end. I mean, the whole time I'm here, and then my successor, and I suspect several successors after that, will be at this work continually. Please.
So you mentioned that you were a public advocate. What was your moment of realization that you wanted to run for city council when you first started?
For city council? Wow. Well, I remember during my service with Mayor Dinkins sort of veering back and forth on this issue a bit. So I don't think I had my epiphany. I think I kind of, there are good days and bad days. I felt for the mayor. He was put through hell, if I could just say. I feel sometimes a little self-conscious about the tabloids and how they describe the realities in New York City. But my experience has been positively gentle compared to what he went through. And obviously, Mayor Dinkins dealt with a much tougher economic situation and other realities. But during the time I worked for Mayor Dinkins, I sometimes thought, wow, this would be a great thing to do, and other times thought, how can you ever get anything done in this environment? I kind of veered back and forth. I think it was afterwards I went to work. We all became unemployed the hard way at the end of 1993. And for a lot of us, we had to figure out the next steps in our lives. And I went to work for a council member for a while. And I think that experience made me start thinking about the possibility. I got involved in my local community in Brooklyn. So it was somewhere after the Dinkins administration. I don't think I had a single epiphany moment. It started to make more and more sense. And I liked the idea of figuring out how to have my own voice in this work, Yes?
It's about the renewable schools program. How happy are you in terms of the returns of investment? I mean, given the quantum of investment that's gone into the program, are you happy with the pace at which you're reaping benefits or the rate at which projects sort of like unfolding?
On renewal schools? So it's a very mixed bag. I want to be honest. We're going to have a formal assessment in the next few months. But, we've tried to determine, how to address the problem of schools that did not get proper investment for a long time and what you could do to change that trajectory. And when I say it's a mixed bag, I don't mean that necessarily as a negative. I mean, we have found that some schools really responded intensely to the investment and have made marked progress and steady progress and will unquestionably not need to be in that renewal status going forward. Others may need it for a period of time, but then should graduate out of it. Some others, don't look like they're going to make it. So in that sense, mixed. But on the other hand, you could say that as opposed to the previous policy, which I think was mistaken, which was a closure across the board policy and left, I think, a lot of kids without good options and did not necessarily replace the closed schools with a better option. I think this was more methodical. And if you think about it in investment terms, I appreciate you putting it in that frame. So it's too simple to say a third, but just work with me for a moment. A third are on the right track right now. A third will be on the right track eventually, but need more investment. A third aren't going to be able to be turned around. Well, that still, to me, is arguably a smart investment, because the ones that we can secure for the long haul, we will have found a more stable and effective route to make them good, solid schools over the long term versus the tumult and the question mark and the sort of unpredictability of building up a new school in its place. So I would argue that could be considered a very good return on investment in the scheme of things. We're not there yet to get to a final analysis, but I'm hopeful, and I also don't think, I for one would not have felt comfortable if we didn't try to see if we could make them work. Yes?
For climate change mitigation, New York City committed itself to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. And that's definitely aspiring commitments. So what do you think is the biggest challenge lying ahead? And what is the one single thing you want to do most to make sure we realize that?
Well, I appreciate the question. I mean, we just announced the single biggest thing we can do is to mandate private buildings retrofit. So we put out a very, very aggressive plan a week or two ago, which is the most aggressive in the whole country. And I've said after President Trump's very troubling decision to step away from the Paris Agreement that we needed to go even farther than our original plan. So we just increased our goals radically. And that's where that building mandate really came into play as a key element. But the thing, to take your question, sort of what's the thing I wish we had more, I wish we had a clear pathway on renewables. We know it can be done, right? We see what's happening in a number of places in the world where they are converting more rapidly to renewables. We don't obviously have a national backdrop where that's happening as fast as we'd like. So trying to figure out how does a city do that, public sector and private sector. And we have tried to find, and I won't get ahead of any announcements because we're still working on it, but we tried to find some dramatic actions we could take on the public sector side that we hope will also push the private sector side. But this, to me, is the opportunity that's sort of staring us in the face, and we have not yet figured out how to fully consolidate it. I do think we'll find it, but I wish I had the answer right now. Yes.
As somebody who's, the mayor, it seems like you recognize that there are systemic issues that we're facing with policing, especially in New York, where they have a really powerful union. Yes. I remember they turned your back on you at one point a couple of years ago. How do you grapple with understanding and recognizing these systemic issues and pushing policies that change how police are operating? They have, a culture that is potentially harmful sometimes. How do you operate with something that powerful?
Well, it's a crucial question. And look, again, I've had a relationship to the unions that, I'm not happy about how they've handled some things, and I don't think it was good for the city how they handled some things. Again, my relationship's been positively civil compared to what Mayor Dinkins was put through. But I think there's a couple of different answers to your question. It is systemic, there's no doubt about that. And obviously it is about systemic racism, and it's obviously also about systemic economic exclusion and how they interconnect. But we also have some big factors in our favor that are not getting enough attention. The police force is changing rapidly. The police force in New York City is now majority New York City resident and approaching majority people of all color, meaning if you take Latino, African American, and Asian. And that trend continues. It's more and more female as well. The last class that I went to graduating was about 20% female, and that continues to grow. Though that reality is just fundamentally changing some of how policing is done. The training is entirely different, and this is where, I understand why people get bits and pieces of information and come to judgments. It's not unfair, but I think if people really look carefully into history and look at what Commissioner Bratton and now Commissioner O'Neill have done on the retraining of the police force is one of the biggest X factors. The force is being trained to think very, very differently, including de-escalation. 36,000 officers are being taught to de-escalate situations. And the ways to do that, and how to use alternative approaches that will lead to less use of force. We're starting implicit bias training soon, which again, I think if I went my time machine back to the Dinkins administration and walked up to Mayor Dinkins and said, NYPD is going to have implicit bias training, he would have laughed me out of the room, right? So a lot is changing, and I do think when you're challenging something like an entrenched culture with the unions, there's a kind of interesting interplay between bold steps and incrementalist steps. And it's very hard, again, as a former activist. The incrementalist steps are not enjoyable or appealing on their face, but they can work really well. So the trajectory on stop and frisk is a great example. We moved that department off of the use of stop and frisk very methodically. And we did some other things to try and address concerns of the rank and file on other fronts at the same time, legitimate concerns. Like a lot of rank and file officers felt very vulnerable to lawsuits against them, frivolous lawsuits by lawyers who specialize in just offering lots of lawsuits, right? And that felt to a lot of officers who actually were trying to do the right thing, like, any way they looked at it, they'd lose, right? So we showed them that we were going to fight those frivolous lawsuits while at the same time asking officers to do some things differently. And there was some give and take there, and there was a sense of like how you pace things, how you sequence things to get buy-in to move an institutional culture. So my argument would be, again, as a true believing progressive, but one who's lived a lot of life, I would say, incrementalism alone doesn't work. And I would say, bold, aggressive change sometimes alone can do it, but sometimes needs another element and another speed to go with it to be able to get the full effect. And I like where we are now. I think the culture is changing a lot. The neighborhood policing model is profoundly important, and it's just so elemental that officers are being trained to say hello to people, say good morning to people, know their names, call them by name, visit with them, go into their store. This may not be the most dramatic reform, but in some ways it's the thing that averts the problems of the past the most, is to humanize the situation. So, sprawling answer, but the point is I think we are systematically resetting the equation. Yes?
This may be a bit more broad than represent, but considering some of us are international students or might be working in other cities, I have two questions. One is, what are the main challenges of your role as a major? And the second one is, what are the things or the key points you've been working on that you think other cities might learn from you?
Well, on the second one, I would say it is addressing inequality is the thing that I've focused on the most. That I think a lot of nations and a lot of cities, are not yet focusing enough on this question and need to. And it's very hard to have a functioning society if people do not feel bought into it and do not feel participant and don't feel they have opportunity. And we've worked very hard to make clear, that whatever your challenges in life, your city is trying to open a door to something better. So, things like pre-K were good unto themselves, but they also sent a message because they're universal and free, that there was some resetting of the equation in favor of equality, or paid sick leave being granted to hundreds of thousands more people, or the work we did, obviously pushing the state to increase the minimum wage. All of these things are powerful unto themselves, but they also, I think, are important to social fabric. Because if you're not doing those things, then you're acknowledging sort of structural inequality that cannot move, and that's when real problems start to emerge, in my opinion. On what's the challenge? Well, as the mayor can tell you, the challenge, or what's not the challenge would be a better answer. It's everything every day. Look, I wish I had a clean, easy answer to you, because any mayor cycles through a whole list of issues every day and concerns. But I think affordability is the one that probably encompasses the biggest macro challenge that I deal with. A city that amazingly, and he's the man who started us on a pathway to greater safety with the Safe Streets, Safe Cities program. Little would Mayor Dinkins have thought at that time that it would work so well in concert with other factors that the city would become the safest big city in America, and that would then cause hyperdevelopment, which, again, development is a mixed bag, right? There's some very good things about development, there's some big challenges, but it's a fascinating 20, 30-year sequence of going from being profoundly unsafe and troubled. This place was really troubled the day he took office. And he didn't create everything before he took office. But the day he took office, if I could take you all, in the time tunnel to that moment, you'd be appalled at what the city was like. And it's unbelievable how far it has traveled, how fast. But that then shocking, just when you're enjoying the changes, along comes a massive affordability crisis because we were safe, because the economy started booming. Everyone wanted to be here, everyone wanted to stay here, and suddenly the price of everything went up, and it became insupportable for a lot of the people from here. So that, to me, is the thing I grapple with every day, and we have some meaningful solutions that we are applying, but we don't have enough. There's no question. There's still elements of that crisis that we still are not reaching sufficiently, and I work on that all the time, trying to find the next step and the next step. Yes?
On
issue of market rate housing, what strategies do you think will be effective? I know there's a lot of pushback from local communities on development and changing their neighborhood. How can we, you've done so much to improve affordable housing for low-income people, but for middle-class people like us, what can you do there? What do you think is effective?
It's a great question. And middle-class people, as you say, people who have a master's degree at Columbia University would solidly count as that, and of course, are an important part of the city's future too. And the interesting challenge is, it's not that there isn't private housing development; it's that it's condos too often, and condos being bought by people not from here who aren't here a lot of the time, right? So it's kind of this weird, worst of all worlds that the stuff that's built isn't being used and isn't for the folks who we want to be active parts of the city. So the real question, I think you're hitting the nail on the head, is like, how do you do more rental market rate housing? A lot of our plan combines market and affordable rental in the same development. And I think the presence of the affordable certainly is reassuring to communities about the worth of the development. But even outside of that, we do want, we would love nothing more than sort of workforce level market rental housing, right? For folks who are working class into middle class with solid incomes, but who are having a hell of a time finding housing here. We would like to see a lot more of that built. But the huge condo buildings are poisoning the well on that other kind of housing, which actually is not that objectionable, I think, to a lot of people. So it's a real challenge. I think part of the answer is to show that more and more affordable housing is being built, to show that the measures we put in place to create some boundaries on the private development process, that those are working more and more. I think that is calming somewhat to the equation. And to try and identify the places in the city where the development of that kind of housing is more acceptable to communities, and there are some still. That describes something of a game plan, but you're right to ask the question because it has been a real challenge to try and calibrate it the right way. Yes?
So recently New York passed Raise the Age, and I was wondering how you wanted to build on that momentum for juvenile justice in New York City.
Well, we have to implement it here, and there's going to be a lot of work just to implement it properly. The number of juveniles on Rikers right now is like somewhere around 150, my last count I saw. So it's not a huge number of kids, thank God. And that's a good story, too, that the number of kids in our juvenile justice system has decreased rapidly as better policies were put in place. But the first thing we have to do is actually make Raise the Age come alive by those kids coming out of the correction system and going into facilities run by our Administration for Children's Services. I think the underlying impulse is to do more and more things that keep kids from ever ending up being incarcerated. And I believe fundamentally you're going to see a drop-off in incarceration levels when the pre-K generation hits. I really do. Because the numbers are so staggering. When the day I took office, 20,000 kids were getting full-day pre-K. Now 70,000 kids are. So we added 50,000 kids a year who are going to get a different start. We're going to go, hopefully, it's going to take a lot of work, but we want to go to 3K next. We want to get all 3-year-olds into full-day education for free. I think that's going to change the dynamics. I think a lot of kids are going to end up on a stronger foundation. And the fact that we are doing so many things to just move away from arrest to begin with, it's again an underreported story. NYPD is just arresting a lot less people. It's amazing. There's been some issues around turnstile jumping. It's an easy example. Turnstile jumping arrests are down 21% from last year. Last year to this, 21% decrease in 1 year. The arrests, we ended arrests for low-level marijuana possession. If that's all someone has is a low amount of marijuana, they're not getting arrested. If they have other issues, if outstanding warrants, or they're doing something else illegal, they can be arrested, but not just for that anymore. So there's lots of ways that we are just minimizing contact with the criminal justice system. So I think those are the two big strands: educate better and reduce the number of young people ending up involved with the criminal justice system on a consistent basis. And I guess the last thing I'd say is anti-recidivism initiatives, my favorite being that Again, I have some things I liked about the last administration here in the city and some things I disagreed with. The one thing I really disagreed with was they were not providing education and training to people in Rikers. So we have initiated a new policy that anyone who's in Rikers gets 5 hours a day of education and training. It used to be only 1 hour a day, which if you think about it for a moment, if you want someone to be redeemed and you want them to turn their life around and re-enter society, if you're only giving them 1 hour a day of education and training, that's not going to work. 5 hours a day is a major commitment, and a guarantee for anyone who was sentenced and served time on Rikers, they're guaranteed a transitional job when they come out of Rikers, which is a really different strategic approach. And the message is, we want people to succeed. We will put skin in the game to get that person on a positive trajectory when they come out. And the whole message from the beginning of their experience in Rikers is, we never want to see you again. You know, we want you to never come back here, and we're going to help you get on your feet, and we're going to help you get employed and go from there. I think that's going to reduce recidivism and be another piece of the equation for young people.
Well, Judge Daniels, in his presentation, mentioned how important education was.
In fact, it's ironic because I'm overseeing the Rikers case.
Why is it something bad?
No, he said everything good. There's been a monitor appointed. He's given a very positive report. It was originally from a case 20 years ago. Judge Motley had the case. There's been significant progress there, and I think the mayor's so correct. I mean, you have kids, you know, young people who are sitting on Rikers Island, and sometimes they just can't be transported from one place to the other, and to get to the classroom. And those, the logistics of that are important. And let me just add another case that you were talking about being inclusive of the city. One of the other cases that was settled before me was making the 50% of the taxi cabs wheelchair accessible.
You get all the exciting cases.
Well, I keep busy.
Yes.
And, you know, that was a major, you know, in the last administration, it was a major battle in court before me. And then, you know, very soon after you took office, they sat down and they came in arm in arm. I was so surprised. They were fighting tooth and nail. And we sat down and we talked about it. And I described it. I described it as the, you know, most inclusive act in this city since Jackie Robinson joined the Brooklyn Nine. That's the way I described it when I approved the settlement. And now, you know, if you listen to stories of people who said they can't go to the theater, they can't go, you know, places because they can't get back home, because they can't get in a cab with a wheelchair. And the only other city in the world, London, all of their cabs are wheelchair accessible. New York City, by 2020, which isn't very far,
right,
will have 50% of its cabs wheelchair accessible, which will be a model for the rest of the country.
Amen. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, you may recall one day I mentioned to you in terms of getting revenue, how Mike Bloomberg fought awfully hard on congested pricing,
yep,
and not successfully.
Correct.
And I remember at the time, I reasoned that a tax on persons who live outside the city but work in the city could generate as much revenue. And I used to know the numbers.
Right.
And
but by now, that would be over $1 billion a year.
And the thing is that we do provide services for non-residents,
yep,
who earn money here. So it's not, quote, unfair.
Correct.
As it were. And I'm always interested in, you know, I attempted it a long time ago. I'm always interested in whether or not that might one day come to pass.
Well, I think it's, you know, another way of thinking of that is as the commuter tax we once knew. You know, you could call it a commuter tax, you could call it a user fee. I mean, you're right to say it is a user fee in effect, because if someone comes in here and works here and they benefit from our police, our fire, our sanitation, et cetera, there is a fairness. I think there's 3 trains running right now in terms of how to address the MTA issue. There is a variety of ideas around congestion pricing, none of which have clarified, and there is no proposal on the table in Albany right now. The governor's made noises about supporting congestion pricing, but with no proposal to actually look at. But in theory, congestion pricing could be a live option. It has not fared well in the past, as you said. And I have a critique of it, but again, we don't have a new proposal to look at. I have proposed a millionaire's tax, which I think is arguably the fairest proposal, a millionaire's tax for millionaires who live in New York City. So it would not ask the rest of the region to pay, and that's both a statement of political viability too, to say, look, we'll tax our own to fix the MTA, and with it we would do what's called the fair fare, which is a half-price Metro cards for low-income New Yorkers. But then the other option, the third option, is the commuter tax or something like it, or a user fee. And one thing I can say for certain, one of those has to happen. The MTA is out of options. It needs a major revenue stream. It's too crucial to the life and the economy of the city. And me being an optimist by nature, and I think my colleagues and we were all in struggle together fighting for a good cause. If we weren't optimists, we would have turned and left town a long time ago. But I am an optimist by nature. I do think the last year has been very clarifying on the question of who's responsible for the MTA, because the MTA was built to create confusion. It was literally built to create confusion about who was responsible. And it was, you talk to the people who did it, they did it on purpose. They knew that having to pass new fare increases was so politically unpalatable that city elected officials would not do it. They were so afraid of their constituents' disapproval, they simply would not increase the subway fare. Apparently it was at, a quarter or something forever because no one had the guts to increase it, even though the subway was falling apart. So they reasoned that any elected official would have that reaction, so they created the MTA as this gray zone of responsibility that could have hearings and pass fare increases, and everyone would be very angry at those hearings, but they wouldn't know who they were angry at because they didn't think, oh, the MTA belongs to someone. Well, what happened over the last few decades is unquestionably the MTA started to belong more and more to the governor of New York. It was clear. The governor named the head of the MTA, controlled the budget of the MTA, had the most seats on the MTA. It was like it wasn't hard to figure out. Governor did not show up. This governor, no other governor showed up at the hearings where people are angry about the fare increases, right? So it just continued the fiction. The last year, starting with Governor Cuomo's understandable attempt to take advantage of the good news of the Second Avenue subway extension, led to a deepening of the question, wait a minute, who's really in charge here? And I certainly have tried to add to that discussion because I was so sick of my constituents saying, why aren't you fixing the subway? And I'm like, I would love to. It's not mine, but I'd love to. And this fight has been a very productive fight because once responsibility is assigned, all other things become possible. And this is, you could certainly make the parallel to mayoral control of education, which I am a huge booster of, which Mayor Dinkins would have loved to have had. I'm one of the beneficiaries, and I do give Michael Bloomberg a lot of credit for achieving that. Something goes wrong in schools, it's me. I can't say, oh, you should talk to Governor Cuomo about that. No, everyone would laugh me out of the room. It's me. Something with police, something with sanitation. It's me. MTA, it's him. And that is good because then he feels responsible to fix it. And Lord knows he has felt that pressure. That is the simple preface to the punchline. One of these 3 things, either a commuter tax or user fee, or some kind of congestion pricing plan, hopefully, in my view, very different from the ones we saw previously, or a millionaire's tax. One of these 3 things, arguably more than one of these 3 things, must be achieved to protect the MTA for the long term. Yes.
So this year there were several really qualified Bible women who ran for city council.
Yes.
And I can think of at least 4 races where those women were beaten by men because they were either outspent or they didn't have the establishment support. And it really seems like we're not going to meet the 21 and 21 initiative. And I was just wondering how you think you can actually elect more women to office when those who do run aren't getting the support that they need.
Well, I think it's a very, very valid concern, and it has to be addressed. I mean, the irony is, look at our administration by contrast. So it's literally the other side of City Hall. We are somewhere in the 54%, 55% of the major leadership roles are held by women now. We have not had a day since this administration started where there was not a majority women in the most senior roles. So if you take the top 1,000 roles or whatever. And I think that's the shape of things to come. There's no one who can say, I mean, it's the same laughable thing we've heard for generations. Oh, if only there was more talent available. There's always been talent available. It's ridiculous. In today's day and age, you can't even begin to argue there's not talent available. I have filled an administration that is well regarded, and it's, let's say, 54, 55% women leadership, and we're doing just fine, thank you. And the same with leaders of color throughout the administration, et cetera, et cetera. So we should dispel once and for all the, are there available people to take on these roles? Is there available talent? Yes. Meanwhile, back on the electoral front, it's nowhere near what it should be. I do believe some of that is, of course, the structural realities. You know, the inherent sexism, the inherent problems of how you get resources and backing from establishment entities. On the other hand, the establishment's not doing so well in politics right now. So I would argue some of this is the traditional notion more women have to run. Some of this is literally a volume dynamic, and I think you know, the greatest recruiter of women candidates in a long time, President Donald J. Trump, is really important to this equation. You know, we're going to see an astounding number of women candidates for Congress and other offices starting in 2018. So I do think some of there's just more and more people running, more and more people getting that early support, and there's a lot of organizations coming together to teach people how to do capable campaigns and start early and start the right way and all that. Here, I mean, I've looked at a few of the races that you indicate. I mean, one in the Bronx, for example, which got a lot of attention, was decided by 200 or 300 votes. You know, that one's hard to argue on a structural level. Like, that one is just sad, you know, and I supported her, and I thought she should have won. But that is, you know, a few little tweaks on that campaign, and she wins. And also her opponent up there, Marjorie Velasquez, her opponent outspent her by a ludicrous amount of money, and that's something I don't think should be allowed going forward, but that will take more work. But I would argue you cannot ask the establishment to just stop being the establishment. You have to overwhelm them, right? You have to fight them. You have to overwhelm them. I mean, I remind you, the gentleman to my left ran against an incumbent Democratic mayor, was told, I certainly heard how many times he was told it was impossible. So he took on the establishment, beat the establishment. I ran for mayor. No Democratic Party organization supported me. The business community was opposed to me. The real estate community was opposed to me. I had no major editorial board on my side. The only editorial board I had was The Nation magazine. God love them. That was my picture, and I won the primary without a runoff. So I think this is not to belittle the challenge of the quote-unquote establishment or the structural barriers. It's to say that that establishment is so invalidated for so many people, you just have to confront it, and you have to storm it, and in as many places as possible, and you will break through in a number of places if you do. That's my view.
Well, I want to thank my friend. You know, he's got a few other things he might be doing right now, and but he knows SEPA, and he knows how important you are. And when we were speaking about gender and sex and whatnot, I looked around. We got a pretty fair representation here.
Yes, sir.
Good 2/3, I would say, and they're terrific. So, my friend, I want to thank you.
Thank you, my pleasure.
And say hi to your bride. And I tell the kids I want to take them to lunch again.
They would love that.
All right?
You have fans. Thank you, everybody.
All right.
Thank you very much. Keep up the good work.
All right. Take care.
And good luck out there in your future endeavors. I will end as I began. There is life after SEPA. Take care.
This is our future.